This episode of the podcast is brought to you by KC Consulting.
There's no doubt that social media marketing is challenging, and it's especially challenging when operating a business in cannabis. In most cases, you're one post away from your brand's account being shut down by Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube for violating its quote-unquote community guidelines. Fortunately, KC Consulting, the premier social media marketing agency based in Dallas, Texas, is committed to helping cannabis companies navigate through the uncharted waters of social media marketing and advertising. The agency specializes in strategy, content creation, channel management, paid advertising, graphic design, and SEO services that will take your social media marketing efforts to the next level. Give them a call at 972-310-7471 or shoot them an email at social@kcconsulting.co today to schedule a free discovery call with the agency's owner and lead consultant, me, Kevin Carrillo. Again, the number is 972-310-7471 and the email is social@kcconsulting.co. Add value, not noise. KC Consulting. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Rod Kight, attorney at Kight on Cannabis. Rod Kight, Kight on Cannabis. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing really well, Kevin. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's really good to have you back on again. I know that you were one of my first guests when I first started this podcast last year, back in April at the height of the pandemic. And man, you've been busy. There's a lot to talk about. So I'm excited to have you on.
Well, thanks. I enjoyed our last conversation and I love what you're doing. And so, yeah, there's always a lot to talk about in the world of cannabis. That's for sure. So, yeah. So a lot going to be happening in 2021. What do you want to chat about?
Well, I think let's first start with the elephant in the room, which would be Delta 8. The hemp industry is just busting about it. Everybody's talking about Delta 8. In fact, I was in Houston for the CBD Expo in December. They actually did an in-person event. Of course, followed the guidelines and whatnot. They had state approval and local city approval. But I noticed that on the trade show, everyone had, most of the vendors and the trade show exhibitors had Delta 8 products. Right. So I know we touched on this when you came on the first time, but let's really dive into Delta 8 THC and kind of what you're seeing from a legal standpoint and maybe some pushback that we're getting from the DEA at this point.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's important for people to understand what we're talking about when we talk about Delta 8 THC. So THC is tetrahydrocannabinol. The form that we most often encounter it is in Delta 9 THC. That delta referring to the double bond on the ring. Within the THC molecule, there's a ring of atoms, and there's carbons attached to hydrogens, and all of these carbons are attached by one bond, but there's a double bond, and the position of that double bond on the ring designates whether it's Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10, so on and so forth. And it also has an impact on how we experience the molecule subjectively in terms of the psychoactive sensation, the high or euphoria that we feel. And so Delta 8 has been known for a long time as an isomer, which is just another form of THC that's been around and at least known for decades. Dr. Meshulam, who is sort of the pioneer of cannabis research, identified it and actually participated in a clinical study of children in Israel who are undergoing chemotherapy treatments. And they used Delta 8 to help with to see if it had some antiemetic properties, meaning, to help with the nausea and the vomiting and that type of thing that usually goes along with chemotherapy. And they found that it was completely effective, meaning like in this situation, across the board, all of the kids received some kind of therapeutic benefit. It didn't seem to harm them. The psychoactive high that's associated with THC appeared to be less, and that's been replicated, I think, in a couple of other different types of studies with Delta 8. So it's a really unique and novel compound, for sure.
And that the reason why you don't have that kind of intense psychoactive effect is because I would think because the THC is isolated. It's an isolate, right? It's just the delta 8 as opposed to some of the other minor cannabinoids that you would have in, say, a full spectrum or a full entourage type effect.
Yeah, sure. So, when we're talking about interacting with the CB1 receptor, which is what is mostly in our brain and our central nervous system, aside from the CB2, which is kind of spread throughout the body, CBD and THC can interact with that CB1 receptor, and CBD tends to offset some of the properties of THC and vice versa. So, for example, some of the anxiety that people can experience with THC intoxication, the CBD can actually minimize that. So to your point about the isolate, yeah, I think the isolate means that where you're just experiencing the effects of that molecule and not necessarily the terpenes, which kind of have their own interactions, or some other cannabinoids that might have some psychoactive effect. You're just experiencing that. And with respect to the intensity of the high, there is a lot about that double bond. It's in the 8 position versus the 9 position, and for whatever reason, I'm far from a doctor or scientist, but that seems to have a pretty major impact on how we experience it. So does, and this is another conversation, the carboxyl ring and the length of that carboxyl ring off the side, and how it binds to our receptors. So delta 8 has come onto the scene, really, I think, because of a few things. First of all, it doesn't seem to have that paranoia or anxiety that's often associated with THC, delta 9 THC. It seems to be muted. Secondly, it doesn't have quite the intense high for most people, which you might say, well, then, what's the point? But a lot of people, they like feeling high, but they don't want to necessarily be on the moon.
Right.
I think that's
I'm
important.
the
But
latter.
I think the latter, right?
Yeah.
I hear it. I've been on both sides of the coin, and depending on the day, I think. But but to your point, and I'm here talking as a lawyer, I think the main reason that Delta 8 has achieved such phenomenal success in this past year is because of its the legal status, or at least arguments for its legality. And so we can talk about that a little bit today, which I think is important. So the Delta 8 that we're talking about typically is derived from hemp. And hemp is legal in the United States, as are its derivatives and cannabinoids and so on and so forth. So it's absolutely clear that that delta 8 THC that is extracted from a hemp plant is legal. It's not delta 9, which is carved out in the statute, and it is a cannabinoid derived from hemp. The problem that we're seeing, and the legal issue here, has to do with the fact that the cannabis plants, hemp plants that are out there now, don't really express a meaningful quantities of delta 8. They might be there in small quantities, but not really enough to make it marketable. You can't just grow hemp, extract the delta 8 in enough quantity to go out and make money. So what happens in the market is that hemp derivatives such as CBD are being converted to delta 8, because all of these cannabinoids, they're different molecules, but their molecular structure is similar. And so they can sometimes be converted from one to another. So we have a delta 8 that's produced from CBD that was derived from hemp.
From hemp.
Does that constitute a hemp derivative, which would clearly be legal, or does that constitute a synthetic form of THC, which could potentially be illegal? And that's the legal question.
and that's where I get tripped up. I mean, I had Senator Nathan Johnson on previously, and he was kind of just learning about Delta 8 and the emergence in Texas. And that's where I've heard from both sides. Experts say it does have synthetic compounds to it. It doesn't, right? So the fact that it's the CBD molecule is being converted into THC delta 8, it seems like there is no synthetic properties in that, because the molecule CBD is natural, right? It's a cannabinoid that's found in the plant.
Potentially. So there's a couple of questions that you've raised. I think these are perfect illustrations. One is, what does it mean for a compound to be synthetic? Is it that the compound itself does not exist in nature? That seems like a reasonable definition. Or is that you have to take one compound and go through a chemical process to convert it, whether it appears in nature or not? And unfortunately and surprisingly, the law does not give a good, clear answer to this question. And so there's two ways that this could impact delta 8. If we were just to take the idea that a chemical conversion it results in a synthetic compound all the time, just by the fact of doing a chemical conversion, well, then all sorts of things would be synthetics. And I think that would be much broader than we would ever reasonably consider synthetics to be. But that's one potential definition. But to your point about delta 8 being found in nature. It is found in nature. I will say that it appears that a lot of the Delta 8 that's on the market is a form of Delta 8, because there's multiple forms of Delta 8 that does not appear in nature. And so if we have, and that's one of my concerns, if we have a CBD that's pushed through a chemical process to result in a different cannabinoid, and that cannabinoid is not found in nature, well, then that could potentially lead to the conclusion that we actually have a synthetic form of THC. On the other hand, if it's found in nature, or, to go back to this point about, if we convert all sorts of things and don't consider them synthetics, well, then this is something that, plants produce Delta 8. This is Delta 8. We've just made a simple conversion, and it's still a hemp derivative. So these are open legal questions, to be very clear, that no court of law that I'm aware of, and I keep track of these things, has made any rulings about.
So has the DEA kind of been looking into this, and they're in kind of a holding position right now because they're working to define that synthetic definition, or what's the current state from a legality standpoint?
Sure. Well, the status is that we don't know. So a lot of, when we talk about federal agencies and state agencies, including law enforcement agencies, a lot of times they will develop their legal positions and their research behind the scenes. And so we do know that the law enforcement is aware that Delta 8 is out there. And this doesn't mean all law enforcement. Some municipal police officer or sheriff in a small county somewhere might not know about it, but we're talking about in the bigger picture. Law enforcement is aware that Delta 8's out there. I believe, because there's enough out there on the internet now, that law enforcement is or should be aware of the legal position of the hemp industry, which is that and I'm again using the hemp industry in big quotes here for many proponents of the hemp industry, including myself, that Delta 8 THC is lawful because it's a derivative of hemp. And so probably they're either accepting that, they're not accepting it and deciding to divert their resources elsewhere and saying, oh, well, we're not going to deal with this. Or potentially they're putting together an argument to counter that, and we may see a big case, and we don't know. So when I talk to clients who go into the Delta 8 industry, I think it does a lot of good for people. There's certainly a lot of money to be made, but this is a highly risky proposition. I mean, you can't go into it without knowing that this is an undetermined area of the law that has some risk.
Right. And you mentioned, of course, in local municipalities that some of this law enforcement agents, they may not understand even that Delta 8 exists, right? But if we were kind of to look across from a state perspective, are some states handling Delta 8 differently than others?
Yeah, they are, either intentionally or sometimes unintentionally. We've put together a state-by-state analysis of the laws and regulations across the country as they pertain to Delta 8, and I'm happy to talk with people who might want to consult about that. But yeah, for the most part, state laws don't address Delta 8, and so what we'll look at is the way that they define THC and the way that they define hemp, because most states define THC along the lines of federal law. Most states define hemp along the lines of federal law, but some don't. And those subtle differences can make a big difference in the legal status of Delta 8. Some states, including Florida, have addressed Delta 8. And I'm not giving any legal advice here. I'll just say Florida appears to be at least sort of Delta 8 friendly. In an FAQ on one of their agency's websites, they did address Delta 8 as being part of the hemp plan. So, but before you go and do this, I would certainly recommend, if you're going to sell it or transport it or even use it, you might want to consult with an attorney, and my firm's certainly happy to talk with you about that.
Right. Well, while we're in this, I don't know period, right? Let's hope that the DEA and other federal agencies are not, exhausting too many resources to combat this, when we're seeing, clear public support, and with the blue wave, the Democrats taking over the Senate, it would just seem like it'd be a waste of their time if we're looking at full legalization in the next couple of years, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the case. I mean, I think it's been a waste of their time for the decades that they've been pursuing cannabis. But absolutely, in the current environment where you have a majority of the population at large, Republican, Democrat, independent, liberal, conservative, thinking that cannabis should be legal at the federal level and at the state level, it's just absurd that the law enforcement would put meaningful amounts of resources into trying to prosecute people for this. It's crazy.
Right, but you never know, right? I mean, it's the federal
You
government.
never know.
So. Well, so hey, Rod, let's switch gears and let's talk about Delta 10. And
yeah, sure.
Oh, go ahead. go ahead and kick it off. And then I have something specific to ask about that because I read an article on your website that was very, very interesting.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, happy to chat about it. So, I guess this is in some ways just a continuation of the Delta 8. We're just talking about the THC molecule and how it's formed. And so the Delta 10 is just it's the THC molecule, but that double bond where the carbon atoms connect is in the 10 position versus the 9 or the 8 or the 7 position or whatnot. And again, that can have some, even though it's a very subtle and small distinction at the molecular level, it can have a large impact on how we perceive it. And so there's a story, and I haven't verified its veracity, but I've seen it in multiple places as to how sort of Delta 10 came to be out on the market. And you may have come across this too, but apparently there's a farm in California that sold some hemp flower and was selling it to a processor, and the processor extracted and came back with a compound they didn't quite recognize. It looked to be under their own HPLC system. A CBC, which is another cannabinoid, but it didn't quite add up, and they finally realized that this was Delta 10. But the unique piece of the story is why, because Delta 10, just like Delta 8, is not produced meaningfully in the cannabis plant, but it was produced in an area where flame retardant for California's been dealing with all these wildfires.
The wildfire last year, yeah.
Last year is huge, and so they put all this fire retardant, sprayed from the sky, and they have a theory at least that fire retardant caused the plant to express more of Delta 10 than normally, and so that's the story about how it came out. That's the science of what it is. In terms of its legal status, its legal status, assuming it comes from hemp, is the exact same as Delta 8, which is to say, I would contend that it's lawful based on it being a derivative of that, certainly if it's extracted from it. But if it comes from marijuana, it would be illegal at the federal level, but it's still a gray area. And we don't know. These things are evolving and rolling out in real time.
In real time, exactly, yeah. And to give the source credit, it was Jason Lupoy, who I recently had on from Terpenes and Testing magazine, as well as Extraction magazine. And that story, I mean, just to reiterate what you're saying, was so fascinating. The fact that the fire retardant actually kind of helped produce that Delta 10 THC from the hemp derived plant much more rapidly than it naturally would, right? Mm-hmm. And it even crystallized, didn't it, when they extracted
yes, that's what I understand. Yeah. It's crazy, but it goes to show how much these outside substances can impact the biology of the plant. And another discussion for another day would be pesticides for cannabis plants and that type of thing. And this is the reason. Sometimes it might produce a beneficial result, but sometimes it could be a non-beneficial result, and you don't know. So it's a crazy story, and I'm glad that you are able to find the source. I have looked around, but I didn't know that was that Jason, you say, is the
Jason
source?
Lupoy, yeah. And in fact, he's gonna be he's gonna be a regular guest like you on the show, because he's talking a lot about terpenes and just all the stuff they're doing there from an extraction standpoint. And so it was really cool to see that he reported on that. One last question on Delta 10. While we're still, of course, learning more about it, as well as Delta 8, do we know the effects of Delta 10? Like you talked about with Delta 8, it's an isolate. You feel high, but you don't have that paranoia kind of effect. Do we know anything about Delta 10 and its effects?
I can't speak personally. I can about Delta 8 and the other things we talk about, but I have not personally tried Delta 10. The anecdotal reports are that the high is not quite as high, maybe even as Delta 8. But it seems like I read one place of all the places that it was actually had a more euphoric effect. So I'm not sure, but I think it's lower. Is that what you've sort of a lessened high?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard anything, but I'm willing to be a guinea pig. So whoever.
Yeah, me too.
And then we could do a whole podcast about our experience with Delta 10s.
There you go. That sounds great. I love it. Usually what I understand in my research and what I've understood from some personal trials too is really the double bond impacts the nature of the high, but also that carboxyl chain that I was talking about earlier. And so THCV is like THC, but it has a very short chain. THCP has a much longer chain, and so then our sort of normal THC has the 5 carbon chain. That's what we're used to and not the 3 or the 7 or whatnot. But the longer the chain, the better binding affinity it has with our receptors, thereby increasing or decreasing the amount of high that we feel. And I think that's rough. I don't know that that's really specific clinical stuff, but that's what I think anecdotally the clinical studies have shown, and certainly that's what I've experienced in trying these different things.
Right. When you put it that way, it just gets me excited about the future of medicine when, I don't know when this will happen, years down the road, but like to be in a position where we can dial it in and really say, okay, with these minor cannabinoids, I want this effect, I want that. And so,
Hmm.
it's like to your point, so that you can really get the effect when it comes to your CB1 and CB2 receptors. And
For
that's going
sure,
to
all the
be
different combinations and of cannabinoids, and then not to mention all the terpenes, and you could, I mean, the complexity of all the different type, a little bit of this, a little bit more of that, less of this, none of this, some of the, I mean, it's crazy. So I think we are going to experience a time where medicine where the cannabis medicine is really dialed in and highly scientific and highly um, fixed on individuals' needs based on their endocannabinoid system. It's exciting
absolutely,
for sure.
absolutely, yeah. All right, so let's kind of take it from a 30,000 foot view and let's talk about the global landscape. So,
Mhm.
obviously, the UN had a historic vote on cannabis. I think that they
Mhm.
removed cannabis from the Schedule One listing under the Single Convention on Narcotics. So, what does that kind of tell us as a trend globally when it comes to the perception of cannabis?
Well, we've got a lot of trends that are happening that are converging on what will eventually be a mostly global market in cannabis, and it's moving slowly in some respects, um, but quickly in others. And so the UN is releasing its sort of its kind of hold on cannabis, and the reason that the UN matters in its perspective on and its positions on cannabis is a lot of times countries who are signatories to treaties, to UN treaties, will fail to act internally based on their agreeing to a treaty. So, for example, the United States, if it were to legalize recreational marijuana, would be in violation of several different UN treaties.
Which
Now,
Canada is, right? Which Canada currently is, because they were one of the first G7 nations to do so.
that's exactly right. And that caused a lot of internal strife. And it seems, on the one hand, you can kind of play it both ways. We say, well, what the heck? We break treaties all the time just when it seems, the right thing to do. But by the same token, the world is interconnected, and these treaties do have meaning. And we really don't want countries to be breaking treaties of any sort just because it makes sense for them to do it, in the moment because it's expeditious from a political standpoint or whatnot. And so, really, what needs to happen is from the top down, in the sense that treaties need to change, or in a way. And I'm being speaking super generally here. This is not an international law course. It's such that countries know how to operate and how to interact with each other. So the UN's position is super important. And then you have the countries themselves and the regional groups. And I think some of the most important movement we're seeing right now is with the EU. There's a really big case that the EU Commission on Justice came down with in regarding Cannavape, which is a CBD hemp company being sold in France. And the brief summary of that case is that some the directors of Cannavape were charged in France for distributing what France had banned, CBD, as a controlled substance. And in the EU, there are, if a substance is controlled, then a country can prohibit it. However, if a substance isn't controlled or there isn't some public health risk, a member state to the EU cannot prohibit the free transportation of goods. And in large part, that's what the EU was developed to do, is to have the free movement of goods and people throughout the whole union. And so if CBD was found to be a narcotic substance under the EU laws, well, then France did have the authority to maintain that prohibition and to prosecute these people. On the other hand, if it's not a controlled substance and there was no other reasonable basis for France to restrict it, well, then France, under its own laws, cannot restrict CBD, and has to allow for that free movement of CBD. And what the Court of Justice found is that CBD is not a controlled substance. Lots of little pieces to dissect there. I'm again giving kind of the 30,000 foot view. The point being that we're seeing some movement in the EU, and along with the novel foods applications that are being
I was
reviewed
gonna,
right now, and I'm
you read my
happy to talk
mind.
about those.
Yeah,
Right.
I was gonna ask
Um,
that. Yeah, go ahead.
well, so the way that pairs up is okay. So now the EU, the Court of Justice has found that that CBD is not a narcotic. That's the term that they use. It's not listed for sure on the 1961 treaty or any other treaties. And if it comes from parts of the plant that are allowed, well, then it's not a narcotic. And so that frees up the flow of CBD through the entire European Union. The bigger issue in terms of marketing to the public is the European Union has what's called the Novel Foods Directive, which says that if a food hasn't been or an ingredient hasn't been consumed in Europe, and I forget the date, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, but prior to that date, then it is considered novel. And in order for it to be marketed, you have to apply for it and get approval. And most of that is about the safety of the product, the end product itself, the ingredient or the food, and also the processes by which it came to be in the food. And so this can be anything from a traditional dish that's just served in another part of the world that is actually not traditionally part of the EU, or it can be a novel ingredient that was formulated last year in a lab. But if it's something that fits within the Novel Foods Directive, then it has to be approved. CBD has been deemed to be a novel food to the extent that it's going to be used in food. And so, in order to market it in the EU, you have to get approval from the European Commission. And that requires an application and usually some studies to show that CBD is safe, and also that your processes for getting it into the food and for developing it are safe as well. So all this is happening right now, and
Yeah,
once we start to see these applications being approved, the Cannabis cases open things up. We're going to start to see a lot more movement in CBD. You're seeing a lot of more medical marijuana movements pushing through Europe, Spain, Germany. The UK seems like it's gonna move pretty quickly here soon. So that's gonna cause a lot of movement.
yeah.
And that's just Europe. So I'll stop talking. And the world is moving rapidly for sure.
No, there's so much to cover. No, and one thing to follow up on that kind of made me think was it seems like the Europe is taking a different approach with their Novelty Food Act in that they're allowing to people to submit applications to get their CBD food products on the market, right? Whereas we're kind of waiting for the FDA to provide consumer oversight so that we can begin getting these products to market and really start to dial in on the messaging and the sales and marketing material that talk about these products, right? So it's a little
Yeah, it's a
different
bit
in that we're in the waiting game, and Europe is a little more proactive in that they're letting people already submit applications to get going.
right. Once a novel food application is approved for CBD in Europe, it's good to go. There aren't any questions. And to your point, the FDA has sat on its hands and has not promulgated any meaningful regulations about CBD, other than the fact that you can't make claims about it, drug claims, or structure function claims about how it impacts the body or affects a disease. But as far as like, is CBD okay in food or not? The FDA says no right now. And that's been a real hindrance. It hasn't stopped the flow of CBD, of course. We see them in stores of CBD
No.
all across the country, but it has put a big damper on investment and really,
And
my
the
clients want to participate. They want clear regulations that they can go by, and they
yeah.
just don't exist. So yeah, I think Europe kind of got off to a little bit of a slow start, and certainly this can be perceived as a hurdle for many. Oh, this application process is expensive, it's time consuming. But once these applications start getting approved, we're going to see Europe jump way ahead,
Yeah.
and that's one of the downsides of the FDA sitting on its hands.
And yeah, and another downside is the fact that the quality of hemp products that are being released into the market contain little to no CBD at all, right? There's a lot of snake oil out there, and it's kind of putting a hindrance on the good actors who are trying to follow the regulations and do the
Mhm.
right thing. So I mean, we talk about it all the time on this podcast. So I'm hoping that we can get a representative from the FDA to come on the
Mhm.
podcast with a representative from the science community and the
Mhm.
cannabis space to really just talk about these issues and say, okay, what are your concerns? What is it that you guys are seeing? Here's what we're seeing from our studies, and make it more of a collaborative effort, because this whole going in the dark and being silent isn't helping anyone.
It's not helping anyone. I think that's great. I hope that you're able to pull that off. That's a tough one to be sure. I testified along with a lot of other folks at the FDA in DC about a year and a half ago, gosh, almost 2 years ago, about this very issue. And we had a lot of high hopes that the FDA would take all this to heart and come out with some regulations, but so far nothing. We've
Yeah.
heard crickets pretty much. So,
Well, here's the hoping, man. I'm with you. I'm crossing my fingers as well.
mhm.
Well, we touched on Europe. Let's talk about Mexico. So I know that they were steamboat ahead. Like, the president of Mexico is saying we're legalizing. There's no doubt about it. And then they kind of put that on pause because the legislature that came through had some things that they wanted to kind of work out. So what is the current situation when it comes to full legalization in Mexico, and when we can we expect that to happen?
Yeah, so the bottom line is that the situation is we're very close. I think full legalization may happen as soon as this spring. As far as a market for cannabis products, I think we're looking at 2022 or 2023. But as far as legalization, we're real close. Now to kind of pull back and give a little more of a frame of reference for that. So what happened is unlike a lot of the way legalizations come about in states in the U.S. or other countries, you mentioned Canada, whatnot. In this situation, the Supreme Court of Mexico determined that cannabis use was a fundamental human right. It's part of their right to the free development of the personality. Is how it's framed. And in Mexico, their laws are in some ways very similar to U.S. in some ways very different. But one of the ways they're different is once the Supreme Court has ruled on an issue multiple times, I believe it's five, then the legislature has to act on that. And the Supreme Court has entered that number of rulings with respect to cannabis, and it has ordered the legislature to change the laws. So on the laws and on the books, so to speak, in Mexico, marijuana and cannabis is still illegal. But the Supreme Court said that those laws are unconstitutional, and says to the legislature, fix it. And that's what the legislature is working on right now. It's been given several deadlines. The most current deadline is the end of April of 2021. We thought we might get something in 2020 because the last deadline was December 15th, and at the last minute it got switched, pushed back to April. And so to kind of pull back from there, where we are is there is a bill. It has been passed by the Senate, but the Chamber of Deputies, which is the other house of Congress, has yet to rule on that. Apparently, there are some changes and some tweaks they want to make. They'll make those changes, then the Senate has to vote on them. So it's sort of like bills in our, we've got the House of Representatives and the
Right.
Senate. There'll be similar bills bouncing back around, but it does seem like we're really close. And when that happens, then Mexico will be the largest legal market in the world, and that's going to mean a lot, both internally for people living and working in Mexico, but also because it will begin to allow Mexico to be an exporter of cannabinoids and cannabinoid-based products to countries where it is legal, whether it be Germany for medicinal purposes, Canada for recreational, so on and so forth, but not the U.S. because it's not federally legal in the U.S. yet. So no exports to the U.S. Yet. But a lot of exciting stuff going on in Mexico. I'm actually living part-time in Mexico now in anticipation of this big change. I think it's going to be a monumental in North America and also for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully when that happens, fingers crossed in the springtime, that really nudges, our governmental lawmakers to say, hey, we got to move on this thing, because
Right.
if Mexico is now in the game, Canada's in the game, you got Germany now, we're in position to be a leader in the world when it comes to cannabis cultivation, science, research and development, all those things. We have the technology to do it, and we have the smart people to do it as well. We're just handicapped by this federal regulation.
Yeah.
Where do you see Mexico falling? Okay, let's fast forward. The U.S. is now illegal to operate. And as more states or countries start to become fully legal as well, where do you see Mexico kind of following in the spectrum? I talked to Joe Crowthers, and he was kind of predicting that Mexico would be a leader when it comes to the low cost cannabis products. Do you see that happening, or do you see them playing in different places, different spaces?
Well, Mexico is big enough and broad and a diverse enough country that I think Mexico can ultimately play in all the different sectors, the high quality, the sort of lower quality, low cost, the scientific piece, the branding piece. But I do agree that I think I see Mexico, at least on the international stage, focusing more on that, your daily weed, your lower cost,
Cost effective,
um,
yeah.
cost effective. I mean, agriculture is just costs less to grow things in Mexico. The climate is much different and much better for cannabis and other fruits and vegetables and things, and also the labor costs are less. But when we talk about the sort of super high end dialed in product, typically we're talking about indoor or some version, some greenhouse type of a grown. Whereas in Mexico you have much more in the way of seasons that you can do, reduce labor costs and reduce land costs. But we're talking about outdoor typically, and you can of course have some major good quality outdoor grown cannabis, and a lot of people swear by it. That sun, the cannabinoids, that bake in the sun. But by and large, I think we tend to associate that with a more cost effective product.
Got you.
And I
Yeah,
think
no,
that's where Mexico will land.
that makes sense. Yep. All right, well, let's bring it back to the U.S. I know that again, I follow the blogs that you publish on your website. And
Thanks,
it's
Glad.
the great stuff. Yeah, Kight on Cannabis. Y'all need to check it out if you haven't. And I know one of the issues that you're focused on right now is California's Prop 65, and as it
Yep.
relates to THC. So why don't you kind of just talk about what's going on there and the implications for the industry?
Yeah, so this is one of those rules that even if you live in California, you definitely need to know about. But if you don't live in California, but you make products that go out throughout the United States, certainly into Canada, into California, you need to know about that. So Prop 65 is a notice requirement that has to do with carcinogens. And so California maintains a list of carcinogens, chemicals that cause cancer or birth defects or reproductive harm. And the list is, I think, over 900 chemicals right now. It doesn't ban these chemicals from being put into food and topical products, but it does say that companies that put these chemicals in their products have to notify the consumers about them. It's called the Prop 65 warning. That label, by the way, Proposition 65, has to do with one of the unique ways that California goes about enacting legislation. And they have citizens can actually go to the polls, and there will be prospective laws on the ballot, and proposition this, proposition that, and they will and then they will vote on whether that law becomes effective. It kind of bypasses the legislature, and so this was Proposition 5, and so this law approved. And one of the chemicals on the list is THC. It was added to the list about a year ago,
in addition to carcinogens, THC was added
as a carcinogen.
As a carcinogen.
As
oh
a
my
carcinogen.
gosh.
Yeah, but that's the finding itself is kind of crazy. In fact, the carcinogen itself is THC, not cannabis, not marijuana. However, in my studies and research, it looked at as though in determining that THC should be on the list, the only things they analyzed, the only studies were marijuana smoke inhalation, so which has all sorts of other chemicals and compounds. So whether or not it should be on Prop 65 at all is a whole question into itself. But it's clear that as of right now, THC is on the Prop 65 list. And so should you, if you have THC in your products, even hemp, CBD, full spectrum or broad spectrum or full spectrum products that have just a tiny bit of THC, are you required to put that Prop 65 label on? And so this is an open question of law. On its face, it appears that if you have THC in your products, bam, you should absolutely put the appropriate Prop 65 warning label, and full stop. That being said, THC that's derived from hemp, which is lawful, which is a natural constituent of hemp, there are exemptions for natural compounds that Prop 65 makes, and so there are a lot of rules and sub rules that are a little bit beyond the scope of just sort of us chatting on a podcast, but where this type of an exemption applies. And so it's certainly conceivable, and I would put forth that certain hemp-based products that contain naturally occurring THC do not require the Prop 65 warning. But before you make any decisions about that, please consult with a lawyer. My firm's happy to talk other lawyers, but that's what Prop 65 is about. Additionally, something that people don't often realize is that beta-myrcene, which is the most commonly found terpene in cannabis, has been on the list for years. You don't see Prop 65 warnings a whole lot with beta-myrcene, but
And
they arguably should be.
and what's so interesting about you saying that, because I did read about that, is by myrcene, that terpene, and from what I've heard from scientists and what I talk about the entourage effect, like those terpenes are good for you, right? So
Right.
it's
Yes.
it's so bizarre that they would be included as harmful chemicals, you know?
Yeah, it is bizarre, and certainly it's California is always ahead of, or usually ahead of the curve in terms of consumer safety, and so you want to applaud these types of things that help with consumer safety, but this seems to be way overreaching, and that's for sure.
Right.
But it's there, and it's something that you need to be aware of, and whether you do a Prop 65 warning label or not. Is a really important business decision, because not only can the state of California sanction you, but also that provides for a private right of action. And I think this is an important legal concept for people to understand. So let's say, well, we're going to decide we're not going to put the Prop 65 warning on our products. We don't think it needs it. Well, California may not have the resources to go after your company, but some lawyer in Los Angeles that focuses on these things may go up and gather up a whole list of different products that they contend should have the Prop 65 warnings that don't, and they'll put together a consumer class action and sue your company under the Prop 65 provisions. And so you might be facing a civil lawsuit based on your failure to provide the Prop 65 warning. So again, I would contend that in certain situations, even products that contain beta-myrcene or THC do not need to have the Prop 65 warning, but certainly that needs to be an assessment that you and your company make with your lawyer, understanding fully the requirements of Prop 65 and the warning labels.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's better to be safe or sorry and at least look into this, because they are cracking down, and this is real, right? So
It is real.
um
It is. It's yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um Rod, you've got to be like in such a unique position, because like cannabis obviously is in its infancy, and all these laws are changing every day and whatnot. And being in a lawyer's position, right? I mean, it's like every day you're probably learning, and then you're like, okay, how do we adapt? Learn, adapt, learn, adapt. It's like, because everything's just continually evolving, right? Is it just craziness?
It is craziness. I have a real passion for it and I love it. And that's the kind of thing that I like. I like having new things evolve, and how do we adapt, and how we're going to advise clients, and this new product or this new law or a lack of a law in an area where you think there should be something governing us. All this is highly stimulating and exciting. But of course, the practice of law in this respect is not for everybody. Other lawyer personality types want to know exactly, you know, this is covered completely. This is section 2, subsection B1, blah, blah, blah. And it says X, here are the instructions. And so this type of law is not for everyone. But in this burgeoning industry, man, I just think it's a blast. It's exciting. It's creative. And I've got really good clients who want to do the right thing. And they're risk tolerant. They're smart. They're focused on navigating this complex, evolving web of laws and regulations, and it's just a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know I'm appreciative that you're in the position that you're in. And the fact that you come on to these podcasts and educate people in layman's terms, because again, it can get so complex with how it's evolving and the legislation is always changing. One last thing I want to touch on, and this is more, focused on sales and marketing messaging, right? We touched
Mhm.
on earlier in the podcast that with the lack of FDA oversight, that it's difficult to market these products online. And in fact, within platforms like social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they don't even let you run ads,
Right.
because you're a cannabis company. So as we wrap up, like, what advice would you give cannabis operators to ensure that their business doesn't become a target to the FTC?
Great question. So yeah, to your point, it is a difficult time. It's challenging sometimes to market products online. It's challenging to get good banking services, because the banks are wary of hemp and cannabis companies. I would say the number one thing that you can do, though, to protect yourself from being prohibited from doing these things, and also protect yourself from legal liability, is not to make health or medical claims. And for whatever reason, that just is tough for some people. They say, "Oh, but CBD does this and it does that," and I agree. But the FDA and FTC say no, and that's just the way it is, and you have to accept that. With the FDA, FDA has some very specific rules that say you cannot make claims about a compound's ability to diagnose, treat, mitigate any form of disease. Otherwise, it's going to be treated as a drug. Similarly, that you can't affect the structure or function of the body, or you can't make claims that it does, or it's going to be treated as a dietary supplement. And the FDA says CBD is not a drug or dietary supplement except for Epidiolex. Period. We can hate that as much as we want to and think it's wrong, but it's the law as of right now. With the FTC, the result is the same, but it's from a different place. The FTC says, well, in order to make a claim of any type, whether it's, CBD cures baldness or CBD is the purest compound on the planet or whatever, you have to have to be able to substantiate that with sufficient evidence that what you're saying is true, so you're not misleading the public. So it's not about the health thing, it's about misleading the public and having a substantial basis. Either way, the paths converge and they say, do not make unwarranted or just don't make health and medical claims. So sorry, I'm being pretty kind of over the top here, but I just want to stress that. It's the way that companies have been popped year in and year out by the FDA. The FTC just recently sanctioned several companies, real money, tens of thousands of dollars in sanctions for making these types of claims. Just don't do it.
Yeah, no, it's important to hammer home. I mean, and it only hurts the industry, right? When you make false claims, you could, eventually kind of make the detractors out of consumers, right? Because you're promising one thing, it doesn't do it. They come back. They're not going to come back to these products. And also like the claims we saw during the pandemic where people were saying CBD cures COVID, like, come on, that's ridiculous. You're totally delegitimizing the industry by saying that, right? Because it is still so new and there is so much snake oil that you're kind of furthering people's argument in that respect. So
that's exactly right. You're playing just into the hands of the enemy.
Exactly. Yeah. So no, don't apologize for that. It's warranted, and we do appreciate your insights as always, Rod. So, as we wrap up, is there anything that you want to address the audience with, things that are top of mind before we hang up here?
Well, I think top of mind is, as we start this new year with a new political season in terms of a new Congress, a new Senate, a new president about to be sworn in, I think it's important to let your local and state and national representatives know how important that cannabis reform is to you. Because to all of us that are in the industry, man, this is like top of the list. Bam, 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 we're having progress. But in DC and in state capitals across the country, it's not the top of their list. And certainly there are things that need to be focused on. But in order to be heard and to keep this industry moving forward, you need to let them know. Call them, write them emails, stop by their office, let them know that you want reform enacted. And just to wrap that little piece up, the MORE Act has been passed by the House. It has not been passed by the Senate, and it is now we have a new administration. We have a new Senate. There certainly is the possibility that the MORE Act could be enacted, and it would remove marijuana and THC from the Controlled Substances Act altogether, and also do a lot of cool stuff with expunging crimes and helping disenfranchised people, get involved in the business. It's just a good bill, and you should definitely support that and let your representatives know that you support it.
I am so glad you brought that up, because that's one last thing I want to ask you. I had a recent guest on, Rico Lamite, and he runs Cannavision. And basically what they do is they try to uncover the truths when it comes to legislation, cannabis, all this kind of stuff, right? They're kind of following things that are happening in real time. And he mentioned to me that the MORE Act, issues within the MORE Act have changed as they tried to push the stimulus bill through. And I don't know the exact changes, but one thing he mentioned was more involvement of the DEA. Do you know anything about that and how maybe the MORE Act from its origination has changed once they pushed it through?
I don't, for my personal practice, I'm not a lobbyist. And so typically if a bill looks like it's going to pass, I start paying a lot of attention to it, because that's going to eventually, once it passes, impact my clients. But as far as all the machinations behind the scenes, I don't follow those as on the detailed level, because they don't impact my clients on a daily basis. That being said, I did just read through the MORE Act just earlier today, and I didn't see what he's talking to in that respect. Certainly, if it's removed from the Controlled Substances Act as a compound, THC and marijuana, the DEA's fundamental job is to enforce the Controlled Substances Act. So if these are not on the Controlled Substances Act, it's hard to see where the DEA would even really have a place.
Yeah, I'm gonna need to. I send him a follow-up email to really just get more information about that before we talk about it. But just as the audience is knowing, I'll be sure to address that in later episodes. But just wanted to see if you had heard anything. So thank you
Yeah,
for
sure.
clarifying that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, hey, Rod Kight on Cannabis. Where can people find your website and whatnot to learn more about the great blogs and messaging that you're putting out?
Sure, thanks. Well, so my website is cannabusiness.law.law. That's for the general website. You can find the blog. Also, for the blog directly, you can just go to Kight on Cannabis, KIGHT on cannabis.com. We try to really address and analyze the all of these issues that are evolving in the cannabis space, whether they be the FTC and CBD, or the European Union and novel foods, or Mexico, or Prop 65, or total THC, or Delta 8. There's all these issues. So we really try to tackle them and give a good analysis of where we think things stand with those. So please read the blog. And if you ever need to reach out, you can do so by emailing me, rod@cannabusiness.law.
Perfect. And we appreciate the work you do. And Rod, I want you to come on again real soon as things evolve this year, if you would be open to it.
Of course, I'd love to come back on. Thanks, Kevin.
Awesome. And thank you all for listening. Bye.